Well, good morning, friends. It's lovely to be with you and stand in this place. Today is the 20th Sunday after Pentecost. It's the 34th day of official astronomical fall. And here in SoCal, it is the 87th day of August. Today, 2 days after it was 92 degrees. I have a deeper tan now than I did at the beginning of fall. And you know, the fundamental role you have when you stand in this is to share good news with people. And so I want to share some good news with you, that you can do fall things anytime you want. If you have a Netflix subscription, you can watch Gilmore Girls any time of year, right? You can drink hot drinks anytime you want. If you want to sit under your weighted blanket, just crank up the AC and sit under your weighted blanket. You can do this anytime you want. You do not have to wait for a date on the calendar to do fall things. And if you want to dress up like a character in Muppets Christmas Carol, the first day it falls below 70 degrees, you can do that like we do here in SoCal, right? So, you are free to do this. Okay, so today's text is the final week in a series that we've been calling Living in Ordinary Time. It's a bit of a pun on the name of the church season, but it's also a way to get at what these texts are about. We focused on a selection of texts from 1st and 2nd Timothy, and unlike most of the other letters in the New Testament, these were probably not written to solve a particular set of problems in a particular place. Instead, they were written to give more general instruction on how churches can be kind of organized in 1 Timothy. And in 2 Timothy, it's just a lot of really good direction on how to live our lives for Jesus. And so it's really meant for this guy Timothy, but it's really meant for all of us, and especially the second one. And it also talks some, in the passage we're going to look today, about Paul kind of leaving the stage, reaching the end of his career and leaving the stage. And I say Paul, if you're familiar with this, people like to talk about whether Paul actually wrote these or not. The vocabulary is different than some of the other ones that he was written, so there's often a lot of energy put into whether these are who wrote them actually. But these letters actually present themselves in the voice of Paul. This is Paul, the guy that we know from the other parts of the New Testament, writing to a guy named Timothy. And that's how we're going to read this, as it is Paul's advice to Timothy. Who knows what happened behind that, but that's how we're going to read this along the way. And Paul feels the need to have a few last words for Timothy at the very end of the book. One, because he's getting old, and two, because he's in jail on trial for his life. So the number of opportunities he's going to have to say things is limited at this point. And I think this is probably why I'm the person preaching this week. I certainly am the closest to satisfying the first thing, being the oldest person in our preaching team. I don't know what actually old is anymore. I'm definitely there. I have like 12 undeniable gray hairs on one side of my head now. So that's there. I get these little bruises in my hand now that it's like, where did this come from? I have contact lenses now that are like progressive lenses, but contact lenses, which are kind of cool. But you only get those if you're old. So I don't even know what old is. Old used to be being older than the mayor of New York, but it looks like Zoran Mamdani is going to be the next mayor of New York. And guys, he's 33. So
it's not looking good for us.
So we all might relate to this text, right? And I'm not on trial for my life with the Romans, luckily. I was once a fugitive from justice. I got a speeding ticket driving through the desert of Nevada in Moapa County, which is the one in the desert east of Las Vegas. And I think most of their revenue is from tickets. And so I got the ticket. I sent in the thing saying, I'll do traffic school. So, which is great unless you forget to go to traffic school. Then you get this letter in the mail that says at the top in big letters, you are a fugitive. And the small fine that you needed to pay goes up quite a bit. But I did pay that. So as far as I know, I am not under threat from the law at this point. So if we look at this text in isolation, it would look like Paul, the writer here, is just running out of gas. He describes himself as being poured out like a libation or a drink offering. And if that analogy doesn't work for you, there's another one that many of you will recognize and cherish, that he feels sort of thin, stretched like butter that has been scraped over too much bread.
Shout out to the Russells.
But this book is not about being old. It's about living in the present reality of God's love and God's goodness. And Paul wants to share these things with us, not because he's old, or I am, but because God is present in a way that transcends and overarches every circumstance that we can find ourselves in. In this passage, we're going to see that Paul is confident that he and others will inherit something great from God, not because of what they've done, but because of what Jesus has done. And not because that they have defeated their foes, but because Jesus has defeated the overwhelming foe of death. We're going to see that the story of Paul's life and ours leads to God's heavenly kingdom, because through Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus has changed all of our stories and all of our paths. So this week's text jumps into the middle of a speech encouraging Timothy to do the work of God's people and to share the good news with boldness and joy. That good news is rooted in the scriptures and in the way we read them and share and live them out together. And Roxanne talked with us about that last week. Now Paul moves on to his part in this. And this is our text today. This is 2 Timothy 4, starting at verse 6. He says, "As for me, I'm already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day. And not only to me, but to also all who have longed for his appearing. At my first defense," skipping ahead a bit here, "at my first defense, no one came to support me, but they all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and save me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen." This is the word of the Lord. As I mentioned before, people often read this sort of like Paul's last will and testament. And it's something like a big leader handing off his organization to a protege. And while it does look like Timothy's work will be ongoing, where Paul's is wrapping up, that's not really how it reads. But Paul seems fine with handing this off, because all throughout this passage, he treats Timothy not as a protege, but as a co-worker, as a colleague. That the ministry that God has given all of them is not some kind of hierarchical system that is going to struggle without the top guy in place anymore. But it's something that they all share, because the person who is really in charge and really enlivening all of this has not been Paul, but it's been Jesus. And Paul, because of this, feels okay about handing things off. And so he talks about some of his own experiences. When things were hard, he fought them. When he needed to hang in there for a long time, like in a long race, he did it. And in all of this, he stayed faithful. And I don't think that Paul's using these athletic images to puff himself up. He's not one of those guys that talking about back in the day, I was this guy. He's not doing that the way that some men, especially men that stand where I'm standing, often do. He's not doing that. But rather, he's just trying to point out to all of us in ways that hopefully people can access that the way that Jesus calls us to is often not going to be easy. And he uses personal imagery here because I think a key point he's making here is that very often the biggest obstacles for us experiencing God's best for us will be ourselves. It'll be the way we remember things, the way we think about things, the way we process things. We don't have doubts about God, but it's the doubts that we have about ourselves that end up being the biggest barrier sometimes. He knows that we have to overcome ourselves before we can begin to think about overcoming any external challenges or opponents. So let me call you back to something we talked about together several weeks ago. At the beginning of the book of 2 Timothy, Paul is encouraging Timothy and us, the readers, to lean into the gift of faith that has been given to us. None of us come to this on our own. Notice the way that Paul doesn't cite his own experience of walking down the road as a persecutor of Christians, having Jesus show up personally and tell him, hey, you need to change things. That's not normative. What's normative for most of us is we get faith from people around us that care about us, that grow up with us, that we grow up with, often from our parents, from people that are alongside of us. And he reminds Timothy of the faith that he has, that he's inherited from his mom and his grandmother and from other people who had laid hands on him, from the community that he's been around. But even more than that, it's critical to remember what God has given us in that process. He reminded Timothy of saying this, and this is a verse that a lot of you may remember, that God has not, this is 1:7 in 2 Timothy, that God has not given us a spirit of cowardice, but a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. Now, if you're a Bible memorizer or just a Bible rememberer, the word cowardice might hit kind of hard in the way a lot of us remembered that and heard the word is translated timidity, which is, I think, a nicer word, or maybe a better way to get at that. This is the only time this word appears in the New Testament, but in John 4:17, Jesus uses a slightly different version of the word in a familiar way. He says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. So do not let your hearts be troubled. That's that word that gets translated cowardice or timidity. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not be afraid. So the first thing I think it's important for us to recognize here is that when Paul is talking about this spirit of warning Timothy to not give in to this spirit of timidity or cowardness or just feeling overwhelmed, he's saying it's something that's not specific to Timothy, but it's something that we all share. Do you notice the language he says here? God has not given us this spirit. That this does not come from how God works in our life. And so his point here is to not shame Timothy for struggling with this, or even to shake him up. He's not trying to shock him out of it by using strong words. No, when he says that God has not given us a spirit of fear or cowardice or timidity, he's establishing a common starting place. That this is the place where most of us begin when we're trying to believe that what God has said and that what God has done is really true, not just out there, but really true for us. He's also saying that it's probably going to be hard. And this is a recognition, I think, of this, the way this word gets translated, troubled, that it is often going to be hard for us in ways that are specific to us to really believe that this is true for us. And that you may struggle with parts of the good news that Jesus has for us in a way that the person sitting next to you does not. And that is not a fault of you. That is part of your unique experiences. That is part of your unique story. And God is very happy to have that be your starting place. So, I'm landing on this heavily because that's probably one of the primary ways that I shame myself, is why is this so hard for you when it's not hard for this person? If I'm unique in this, thank you for giving me an opportunity to work through this in front of you. But perhaps I'm not unique in this along the way. But all of us have some sort of starting point that is going to be unique to us. And the fact that there are things that we will struggle with that someone else won't. That there will be things that we will have a hard time believing in. That we can believe in God's goodness, but we have a hard time believing that God's goodness will apply to a particular part of who we are. It's not a problem. It's a starting point. It's where we begin. It's where we begin. So it also means that there are other voices that will make it hard for you to hear God's goodness. Those might be people from church. Those might be people from your family. This could just be the overall vibe we're living in right now that makes it difficult to believe these things. But you guys need to know that this is not new. It is not new. The first person from a Christian leadership position that told people things that turned out to be hateful to them or hurtful to them was not a youth pastor in 2005 with frosted tips and Oakleys. Okay, that was not the first time it happened. This has been happening for a long time, and it's happening in his time as well. And so he's trying to encourage us out of that. That is not that does not have to be our experience along the way. And that's why throughout the book, Paul points to the positive experiences that he's received and Timothy's received from others. But he does understand that it can go the other way and settle into our hearts. So at the beginning of fighting the fight, of running the race, of staying faithful to what God has given us and called us to, also means stepping into the power and love and self-discipline that is part of our heritage, that's part of our birthright as God's children. This power that he talks about here is the power to say no to the inner narratives that are rooted in our hearts, in our failures, in our traumas. It's the power to believe, because we know that we are loved, that our failures and our traumas are not the final word about who we are, no matter how loudly they might sound in our hearts and in our souls. And this power that he talks about here is a power that is rooted in God's love to do the long and sometimes tedious and often painful work that he describes here as self-discipline. It's the process of exchanging the lies and the misunderstandings that we've somehow come to believe about ourselves, about how the world works, about how God works with us, for the truth of God's love and power and acceptance for us. It means that our present failures will not be ending points, but merely the place where the fight, the run, starts again. And while I've been talking about this in individualistic terms, we can't stay there, because this passage discusses that the embrace of power, of love, and self-discipline is something that God gives to us collectively. It's not an individual power. We best experience it. We only really experience it when we experience it together. There is a kind of multiplying effect that happens when we connect with others who are on the same path, when we are trying to live into the same reality along the way. We hold it together and we live it together. The crown of righteousness that Paul looks forward to in today's text in verse 8 of our passage is not his crown. It's a crown that belongs to any and everyone who loves God and is willing to step into the life that God has offered us. We do this together, and we live this together. This makes the second part of the passage that we read today even more essential. When we know how essential we are for each other, how important it is to support each other, to empower each other, and to simply be with each other, Paul's words in verse 16 are pretty heartbreaking. You may have noticed that the lectionary chose to skip seven verses from 4:8 to 4:16. And I think the people who put the lectionary together did this because it's just a bunch of personal logistical stuff. Please send this person to me. I'm going to send this person to you. I have a cloak here and some books here. Can you please send those to me? And these are not heavy theological tomes, so it's kind of skip over them. But I think it reflects the individualistic way that we too often read what's happening here. And I think these really are essential to what's happening. That Paul is mostly alone in his imprisonment in Rome because he has sent most of the people who are with him to go help others. In a really nice way, he asks that Mark be sent to him. And Mark is somebody that Paul had a break with earlier in his career. So somebody where they had not been on the same page with each other is now somebody that Paul feels like would be really helpful to him as he sits there imprisoned and waiting for his next thing. It's a really beautiful it's a really beautiful testament to the power of God to help us get over ourselves and the power to embrace God's goodness for all of us. So, again, I think these verses were left out because Western Christianity does tend to think of our personal relationship with Jesus as simply that. We do it ourselves and for ourselves. But over and over again, the actual words of the New Testament tell us that we do it together. That we live the life that God has for us with each other and for each other. And so, with the heartbreaking words of verse 16, Paul is under arrest, and he's a threat to the Roman Empire. But as a Roman citizen, he has certain rights within the system. And one is that something like he gets the right to what we would call a preliminary hearing. And in verse 16, he tells us that at that preliminary hearing, he had to go in there by himself. And he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He doesn't say that, maybe there was something that prevented people from going with him, or they didn't know that he was going into this hearing. Instead, he says bluntly that his friends deserted him. Now, it would be reasonable to think at this point that Paul could express some anger, some at least disappointment, or something that would look a lot like self-pity, but he probably wouldn't use that term for himself. But instead, he says emphatically, the language he uses here is emphatic, may this not be counted against them. So he says this because he knows that he was not alone. Look at what he says here. He says he knows this because Jesus is alive. That Jesus was standing beside him in a way that was just as real as the chains that he was probably wearing, and just as real as the judge that he was facing, and either the real or metaphorical lions that lay in his likely future. He knows this because of something that he discussed back in chapter 2. Throughout the letter, he speaks to Timothy and to us, and I think to himself, to remind us over and over to link our current experiences to the big plan of what God is doing in Jesus in this world. That God's plan for us, God's goodness for us to the world has brought a disrupting change that was brought by Jesus' death and resurrection. Remember the words that Daniel spoke to us a couple weeks ago. This is from chapter 2 of 2 Timothy. It says, remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descendant of David. That is my gospel. Over and over again. This world is different than you think it is. This world works differently than your inner heart will tell you it works, because Jesus was once dead and he is now alive. Because Jesus has defeated the powers of sin and death, things don't work the way you think they do. Things don't work the way your expectations do. Things don't work the way your fears and your nervousness and whatever that word that got translated timidity or cowardice or whatever says. The world doesn't work that way anymore. That's not the final answer. That's not the way it goes. He goes on to say, this saying is sure. This is sure. Everything else that we're experiencing is malleable and changeable, but this is certain. If we have died with him, we also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he'll deny us. But if we are faithless, he remains faithful, because he cannot deny himself. So Paul knew that when Jesus defeated death, he defeated all the powers that could stand against us, including our inner voices. That the empire of death was even greater than the empire of Rome. And so the living Jesus stood beside him when he stood in front of Caesar's judge. When Jesus was raised and broke the power of death and sin, he broke the power of all stories, all narratives, all patterns in which we can get stuck and held down. Our stories, for good or for bad, remain our stories. But breaking the power of sin and death means that the cross also breaks the power of those stories and replaces them with the spirit of power and love and self-discipline. We continue to live in the presence of our stories in the same way that we continue to live in the presence of sin and death. But the good news is of the gospel. The sure saying is that we no longer live under the power of sin and death. And we no longer live under the power of our stories. We are empowered, and we are encouraged, and we are invited to live new stories. So friends, know these things. Know that you are okay. You are not your failures. You are not your wounds. You have been saved. You've been saved from what you have done, and that you have been saved from what's been done to you. Know that you are not alone in this, that we are with each other, and that the Lord is with us, and in us, and through us in all of this. Know that our stories are as dead as our sins. They may be present, but they are no longer powerful. So friends, let's keep fighting together. Let's keep running together. Together, let's help each other stay faithful. And together, let's receive from the Lord what he longs to give to all of us. Amen.